that in my conversations with Brenner Bandar, we're more comfortable with the idea of the deputy, and we're not still quite comfortable with the notion of the outlaw as it applies here. But I'm going to try it out anyway, and you can tell me whether you find it persuasive or not. So let's begin with the deputy, and let's begin by thinking about deputization. But I'm going to go to a very different place altogether. And the quote here comes from a phenomenal geographer, a black geographer called Ruth Wilson Gilmore, from the United States. And what she's describing in this quotation, which I'll unpack in a minute, is the shooting of a black man, an African-American man called George Floyd. And George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis police in the United States. Now, George Floyd had gone to a convenience store in Minneapolis to buy cigarettes. A store worker, however, worried that the money was a forgery, was fake. As a consequence, the store worker chose to call the police. That then led to a cascading series of events, the outcome of which was the murder of Floyd by the police. The thing that set in motion, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it, that sets in motion the events that resulted in Mr. Floyd's brutal murder was that an employee at a convenience store thought that they had been handed a counterfeit bill. Now, this young person, and she assumes it's a good person, working for a good employer, did their job to keep their job. But then she asked this really interesting and important question. We have to ask ourselves, why couldn't it be that they take the money, complete the transaction, and then deal with it afterwards? Why did they have to call the police? She says they call the police because they've been deputized. They are, in a sense, acting as if they were a deputy police officer. And she wants to make an argument about the way in which racism works within the policing system more generally, such that more and more of us become deputized by the police, acting as if it were as extensions of the police more generally. But I'm going to use this in the different context of preemption law and take this, I think, very rich notion of deputization here and bring it forward. Now, so to be deputized refers to a process whereby the police officer gives informally, in this case, or formally, some of their powers to civilians, to non-police officers. So non-legal actors now become legal actors. If you're deputized, you can take on some of the powers of the law official. A deputy enforces law. They make judgments regarding how and when to enforce law. They're empowered to use force, including bodily violence. Now, when we think about preemption policy, our argument is that it deputizes white settlers in several interlocking ways. It gives them powers, legal powers, despite the way, in theory, it actually controls their powers. In reality, it actually extends those powers in creative ways, the effect of which is actually ultimately often violence, settler violence. And this is fundamentally because it's highly discretionary. It empowers the settler to make a whole series of legal judgments on the ground as they move forward over time. The effect of this is to make the settler a lawmaker themselves. They have the power, effectively, to make property on the ground. Now, property is, of course, not just about a person's relationship to land. It's also, by definition, about relations to others. So deputization also has the effect of facilitating forms of violence against those who are imagined now to be non-owners, indigenous people in particular. So most immediately, preemption applies to unsurveyed land. This land has yet to be mapped out by a state official. So this means that the settler can go to land, often remote land, like in Bulkley Lake, and make decisions about which land to claim. Deputization in this sense entails powers of territorialization, the power to make and remake territory. And in so doing, of course, by drawing lines, by driving stakes into the ground, to make and to remake property, forcibly converting indigenous lands into settler property. That discretionary power is important. Even commentators at the time were struck by the kind of flexibility this gave the settler. So there's a quote here in the slide from a newspaper in 1861 in which the preemptor is described as wandering through the woods until he finds a piece of land that suits his fancy and then driving stakes into the ground. Now, there were constraints we've noted already. One of those is that you can't preempt land upon which there is an Indian settlement. But crucially, this was never defined. In other words, it's up to the settler to decide, is that an Indian settlement or maybe not? And we're going to come back to this point in a minute. Preemption policy, in theory, required strict compliance with a series of detailed rules, but in reality, like settlers have to stay on the land, they have to cultivate the land and so on. But in practice, the state relied on the preemptor reporting their compliance with these rules to distant authorities, many, many miles away, who provided very limited oversight over the processes because there was a very limited state apparatus in operation at the time. This has the effect of making the preemptor effectively legally autonomous. They have, in a sense, the power to self-govern themselves, the degree to which they're abiding by these own rules, interpreting those rules, not surprisingly, in ways that tended to work for them. So as we noted, this has the effect of allowing settlers, this deputization process has the effect of allowing settlers to carve out territory from indigenous land. But territory and property are also about enforcement. They're about mobilizing force when needed. And preemption law, and this is interesting, empowered settlers by giving them certain proprietary rights. In other words, they have the rights, in many cases, of the person who actually has full title to the land, the power to use trespass against somebody on their land. So even before they have full title, they can enforce property rights, even before becoming full rights holders. They were also required to improve the land, to cultivate the land. This also, of course, incentivizes them to expel others, including notably indigenous people. And it's basically only indigenous people who are on the land at the time. So law thus directly and indirectly deputizes and thus empowers the settler. It gives them powers to perform private property, even though they don't have private property. It does this through its absence, it's not there, or it does it by empowering settlers through discretionary powers, allowing settlers to make law-like decisions. This can be remarkably effective on the ground. In so doing, the state as a deputy becomes an extension of the state, not just an actor engaged in law-like practices. So here we can borrow from Judith Butler, who talks about the idea of the petty sovereign. A petty sovereign is a mini sovereign, if you like, a deputy. Butler writes about this in the context of the suspension of law, in the absence of law, but here the settler becomes a deputized extension of the law, solidifying the sovereign power of a very thinly stretched settler state. They are the state, even at a very distant remove from the official centers of state power. This means that they're able to resettle land in an expedient and timely manner. But in so doing, they also become enforcers of a new set of colonial logics, the enforcers of, if you like, colonial territory, because they now have these proprietary powers, the powers to expel, the powers to draw a line on the ground. The historical geographer Cole Harris talked about the importance of this, the role of non-state officials, settlers, enforcing this new sets of colonial logics of settler property against indigenous people. It's not state officials who are doing this, it's Settlers with property entitlements, with leases, with preemption claims. They're monitoring, they're watching indigenous people as they move across their land that is now reimagined as settler land. Such watching, as Harris put it, backed by the law, turned native people into trespassers. It defined where they could go and could not go. Now, crucially, this speaks to the kind of informality, if you will, of this process. And these are preemption applications from settlers in the early 1870s, 1890s. And you were required to send a two-page document in which you said, this is roughly where it is, it's about this size, and then because it's unsurveyed, you draw a line on a map, literally the back of an envelope, in which you said, this is the land I'm applying for. And as Harris puts it, these few lines scratched on a page, because of the way they feed into colonial logics and preemption policy, facilitate this magic of colonial land dispossession in a striking way. Now, deputization is racialized. Preemption is formally unavailable to indigenous people. Only white people get to be deputies of preemption. This is from one of the acts at the time. As you can see, it applies to a British subject who's effectively a white person, and preemption, except in very, 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 very rare and effectively vanishingly rare cases, shall not apply to any of the so-called aborigines or indigenous people of this continent. Preemption is also racialized, of course, because it's predicated on racialized notions of improvement and use. To be a preemptor required conformity with settler enactments of property and cultivation. The power to reterritorialize, the power of the deputy, is also directed at indigenous people and their land. You can't preempt land that is occupied by another settler. It has to be, quote, unoccupied land, that is, land that is effectively indigenous. So that's the deputy and deputized power. Now let me move to the outlaw. And as I said, we have some debates about this still. So what's an outlaw? As we said, the short answer to that is an outlaw is a person who has broken the law. They are literally in a space outside law. But this is technically inaccurate. An outlaw is not simply in a space outside or in opposition to law. Like the deputy, outlaw status is legally produced. Outlaws are made by law. And here we need to understand the idea of outlawry, or the legal designation of outlaw status. Now, outlawry is very old in European law. You can find precedents in Greek law, in Roman law. It was taken up by Germanic and Scandinavian legal systems. Essentially, it's a form of legal expulsion targeted against those who are deemed to be threats to the collective or to the rule of the king. Once outlawed, a person becomes a new legal category, a person who is stripped of legal protection and is subject to the violences of others. So in Icelandic law, for example, someone who was declared an outlaw lost the rights accorded to members of the community, the right to own property included. They were exiled for life, they were stripped of legal protection, and they were treated as though they were, legally speaking, dead. Now, outlaw status is a product of law. In the English common law, it came with a proclamation. Caput gerat lupinum. May he bear the wolf's head. This idea that the outlaw now is like the wolf. Deprived of legal protection, the outlaw, like the wolf, could be killed with impunity, by another, a non-outlaw. Indeed, non-outlaws were obliged to subjugate the outlaw in the same way that they were obliged to kill the wolf. So outlawry, therefore, entails a sort of legal relegation in which a person is placed in a condition of heightened vulnerability, while the lawful are provided legal immunity to dominate the outlaw. This isn't a state of legal abandonment, because law is clearly operative here. It's not a space simply of unlawfulness. Outlaw status is legally produced and legally regulated. Outlawry is clearly tied to a set of understandings about worth, membership, and standing, which can very quickly and very easily become racialized in all sorts of ways. It's also spatialized because the outlaw is imagined as living in outlaw zones, outlaw spaces, liminal, transgressive spaces. Now, one of the questions, and we're struggling with this, is the degree to which outlawry is a concept that's useful in understanding the status to which the legal status assigned to indigenous people under colonial law, the degree to which it makes sense to think about them as effectively outlawed by property law. This is still up for debate, but I think fundamentally the argument is that the status of the indigenous person is profoundly legally regulated and legally constituted, however defined, which places them in a space of vulnerability, explaining the sorts of violences that could be visited upon them by the deputized Billy Clark. Outlaws, like indigenous people, are forced into a space of legal relegation. They're imagined as outside the space of settler law. They're imagined as a threat to settler notions of property and sovereignty. This clearly entails a racial devaluation of their personhood. Like the outlaw, they've been stripped of their rights to land. Interestingly, as we noted, they are expressly forbidden to preempt land. And like the classical outlaw, they also, in a sense, bear the wolf's head. Although others are not required to subjugate them in the way that the outlaw classically is, the presumption that they have no rights to their land except tiny reserves. This is a map showing reserve land in the early years of the 20th century. It's the same geography now. The presumption that indigenous people have no rights to land mean that their relationship to land and to culture is to be destroyed. It doesn't count. Their land is reimagined as crown land, as state land that can and should be transferred to white settlers. So there's a violence, I think, that's tied fundamentally to their relegated legal status. It's in these terms, perhaps, that we can begin to understand the violent encounter between Clark and Isaac, and I'm now coming to a close. Because Clark has been deputized, as it were, by property law, he has the legal ability to carve private property out of indigenous lands. Isaac's relegation, his outlawry, sees his rights to the land being denied. His land becomes crown land that Clark can claim as his own. Indian Isaac, from Clark's perspective, was trespassing on Clark's land. Clark had the powers, he had the duty, he had the requirement to expel trespassers. Now, settlers were not supposed to preempt land where there was a, quote, Indian settlement, as we noted earlier, but this was never defined. So why the destruction of these houses is one of the questions we're grappling with. And arguably, the threat that an indigenous house posed to Clark's settler claims required that it be destroyed. The house was a target. It had to be removed such that there was no Indian settlement on the land. Clark makes waste in destroying Isaac's house. Now, waste in English has two meanings here. The first is a Lockean sense, in the sense of the writings of John Locke. By burning Isaac's house down, by expelling Isaac and his family, Clark makes the land into waste in the sense that John Locke would understand it. Waste in this sense is land that is unused, land that is empty, land that is available for cultivation by the rational and the industrious and rational white man. But to do so requires that Clark lays waste to Isaac's home and family in the second sense. To lay waste refers to the process of destruction, of retribution and violence. You lay waste to an enemy and their lands. It's also in this light, I think, that we can understand Agent Loring's recognition that there will be no justice for Indian Isaac. He will have to wait forever. Land becomes property, when the scholar Saito puts it, when lived on by some people, but not by others. speaking to the legal, illegal, formal, informal we discussed earlier. Without whiteness, it is not property. Put another way, the deputized, because they are deputies, are protected. Their lands are to be protected. As a result, the illegal becomes regularized and formalized. Now, this is Billy Clark and the story of Indian Isaac are from more than 100 years ago. But my point here is that preemption and the practices of racialized deputization and relegation or outlawry cast a long shadow in the colonial society that I live in. Many colonial land titles now can trace themselves back directly to Billy Clark and the violences of 100 years ago. Edward Said said that dispossession is not a very pleasant thing when you look at it closely, and I think looking at it closely reveals some very unpleasant things. And this comes close to home. The home that I live in, the home that I'm talking to you from right now, can also be traced back to a preemption in 1884. The image on the screen is the Crown grant from 1884, where the land was transferred to somebody called George Henry Howison through what I understand to be preemption. So my entitlement to this land as a settler, as a non-Indigenous people, can be tied directly back to those racialized practices. But there's perhaps also a more immediate point of connection. Private property more generally has been likened to a sort of sovereignty. Private property not only requires that the state sanction it and recognize it, it also, of course, enables the owner to exercise forms of power. They can become like a little sovereign, like a little king, or a petty sovereign. Now, this argument, broadly speaking, was used by an American legal realist called Morris Cohen in the 1920s in a very famous paper called Sovereign's Property and Sovereignty, in which he challenges the distinction between public and private law, where sovereignty is something exclusively to the state, noting the ways in which sovereignty can also be found in the so-called private law. He wanted to challenge, as a realist, he wanted to challenge the myth of property as purely private. He wanted us to see the reality of property. Property as a form of sovereignty means, Cohen pointed out, that dominion over things is imperium, or rule over other people. That's an important point as far as it goes, but I think we need to take it that much further, recognizing in the colonial context that as a private property owner, I'm not just a little sovereign, I've also been deputized by these colonial logics. An owner of unceded indigenous land, I too am a petty sovereign, enforcing colonial territoriality and sustaining the world Frantz Fanon described of as one, quote, divided into compartments, a world cut into two. Thank you very much. I hope that was useful. Now I will stop sharing and
Muchas gracias, Nick. Muchas gracias por la presentación llena de ideas muy interesantes, pero también útiles para pensar la relación entre los pueblos indígenas y las tierras urbanas y no urbanas, que es cierto que estamos pensando en este seminario. Voy a tratar de hablar más lento. En este seminario, para la traducción, en este seminario tenemos una gran variedad de ponencias, las de esta mañana y las que todavía vienen. Y pensamos que el valor de este seminario es justamente poner el enfoque en la propiedad. Una cosa que muchas veces no lo hacemos, no hacemos ese esfuerzo pensando que la propiedad simplemente es algo que no tienen los pueblos indígenas. Creo que estas ideas son bastante útiles, esta idea del preemption, ¿cierto? El derecho preferente de compra, este mecanismo muy particular que funcionó en lo que llegaría a ser Canadá, pero también esta idea del delegado, del sheriff versus el forajido, ¿cierto? El outlaw, el fuera de la ley. esto del delegado como pequeño soberano, el forajido al margen de la ley, el caput gerat lupinum, nunca lo había escuchado, pero esta idea de la discreción, ¿cierto?, en la aplicación de las leyes, la territorialización de la propiedad, pero pienso que quizá para mí lo central está en esta diferencia racial en la definición de la propiedad. Cuando es algo quizá muy simple, pero no lo había tomado en cuenta. Cuando dijo sin blancura, o whiteness, ¿cierto? Sin que la persona fuese blanco, si la persona no es blanca, o sin blancura, no hay propiedad. Es muy interesante. Una tierra, el hecho de ser indígena o blanco hace una diferencia para la forma como la persona puede acceder a los mecanismos ¿cierto?, de legalidad frente al Estado. Así que, bueno, perdón, ahí volviendo a esa idea, yo creo que esta idea aparentemente tan simples, después se territorializa, ¿cierto? Y crea los territorios nacionales con los cuales estamos trabajando hoy día en sus calidades. Me detengo para abrir el micrófono. Claramente me interesa mucho el tema, pero abro el micrófono para preguntas. Si hay más comentarios, más preguntas. No sé si está Antes había como un video chiquitito de Blomley, ¿no? No se puede... no se puede juntar, quizás. Ahí estamos, ahí está. Ya, listo. Entonces, no sé si hay... Sí, yo creo que eso fue un saludo. Creo que aquí Catherine quería hacer una pregunta.
Quería hacerte una pregunta y es si viste algo en tu trabajo sobre la relación de pronto con las mujeres y la posibilidad de ver, bueno, la tierra también como ese vínculo pues para las poblaciones indígenas también, una imposición marcada por la vía de los hombres que podrían heredar la tierra. Quería preguntarte eso, como la posibilidad de ver cómo viste la relación de las mujeres con la tierra.
Thank you. I think I got the translation to that question. The relationship between women and land and property in this project. Thank you very much for asking that very, very important question. Obviously, the process, as you could see, of land preemption is inherently patriarchal because it presumes the man or the widow as the active agents of cultivation and land preemption. So I think that speaks to a particular gendered logic of property. Property is not just about whiteness; it's also about masculinity, which is crucial to the story. It's also important in terms of the counter narratives, because the testimony that I described from this commission, although it's incredibly powerful because it's one of these few moments in which you see indigenous people actually speaking back to the state at this time, is driven by men. It's so the people who are told to speak before the commission are men. They're the chiefs, the male chiefs, which is a denial of the political institutions actually operative in many of these indigenous cultures. Many of them are matriarchal, where women play a very central and important role. But of course, the state, the colonial state, sees the man and sees male priorities, and that is reflected in the testimony. There is, however, some very important testimony which we've been working with, which speaks to settlers destroying land or expelling land over which women have property rights, because women traditionally have particular relationships to land that differ from men. So you see moments in the archive where women's stories and perspectives are actually made more visible, but then again, they're closed up in important ways. But more generally, I think speaking to gender in this analysis, rather than focusing on race, would be an important inflection in the story as we move forward. So thank you very much for that question.
Muchas gracias por la respuesta. Hay un comentario en Zoom, no tengo el autor, pero dice: el régimen jurídico sostiene a la propiedad en los países de la tradición continental europea. Es una forma positiva kelseniana muy dura. No es una pregunta, es como un comentario. Y hay otro comentario de Volker. Sí, no sé, no veo otra. Hay un comentario, una pregunta ahora. Sí, gracias. Ya, ahora sí, termina ahora con una pregunta. En el caso del common law, perdón, este es del profesor Volker Alvarado, aquí de la facultad. En el caso del common law, o del derecho común, ¿resulta flexible instalar regímenes diferenciales de propiedad, entendiendo que la tradición colonial prefigura lo civilizado desde la propiedad en sí? No sé si se pudo traducir. Cuesta un poco, bastante densa la pregunta. Voy a repetir. En el caso del common law, ¿resulta flexible instalar regímenes diferenciales de propiedad, entendiendo que la tradición colonial prefigura lo civilizado desde la propiedad en sí? Y nos avisa Volker que está con COVID, así que no puede participar en el... ¿Sí? Ahora.
I think I got some of that, and maybe I could get some more help on that. So I understand the question relates to common law versus civil law. Common law traditionally is more flexible in its approach as compared to civil law. I believe that was the emphasis, but I'm not sure what the question is there in regards to that. I'm sorry. We're moving between common law and civil law. Now we're moving between Spanish and English. So if there was some more clarity on that, I can address it. I'll try to.
Sí, también entiendo que hay una diferencia entre el derecho continental europeo, que es muy positiva, muy dura, ¿cierto? Exactamente. Y el common law inglés, ¿cierto? El derecho común es muy flexible. Se entiende que es más flexible. Entonces la pregunta es, si cree que el common law es más flexible para instalar estos regímenes diferenciales de propiedad.
Okay, that's a very large question, and I'm not I'm not an expert in civil law or a comparative law scholar, so I can't speak directly to that question. I would maybe others can have more insights to it. I mean, I think what's interesting with the preemption policy, although well, there's flexibility and non-flexibility at the same time. I think that's what's interesting. One is a change in the doctrine, so a change in the way in which preemption is understood as it moves from its traditional European international law domain to the domain of private law. And I don't know whether civil law has that flexibility. That would be an interesting question. But I think what's also interesting is that the doctrine itself, as it's applied, is actually is theoretically non-flexible. It's actually very strict. I mean, there are all sorts of strict rules. Obviously, the authorities are trying to see like a state, if we can use that phrase, to manage these preemptors on the ground, and giving them very, very strict rules about how many stakes they have to put in the ground. Yet at the same time, it built into that is this discretion and flexibility. So maybe the distinction between flexibility and non-flexibility is something we also need to challenge. That wasn't a very direct answer, but it's the best I can do under the circumstances. Thank you.
No, yo creo que justamente es un tema bastante amplio para entender esta flexibilidad. Como usted dice, hay una cierta rigidez que lo ven ahí en el contexto canadiense, ven como algo rígido que después se aplica de forma flexible. Ahí faltaría más estudios, para eso podemos proponer algunos estudios comparados, ¿no es cierto? Pero acá nuestra tradición, acá en Sudamérica, sentimos que siempre el análisis es que la ley es muy dura, es muy positiva, es muy poco flexible. Pero yo intuyo, sin conocer en profundidad la pregunta, que justamente acá va a pasar al revés. La ley es muy dura, pero la aplicación es muy flexible también. Pienso que va a ser algo parecido, pero eso lo dejamos para el proyecto conjunto. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Sí. Aquí adelante que el cordón es cortito.
¿Su nombre? ¿Mi nombre? Me llamo Fabiola. Soy de Chuquicamata, pero estoy viviendo hace 5 años acá en Concepción y me titulé este año de arquitectura acá. Y mi pregunta va más a las relaciones del derecho a la propiedad respecto a que, viendo el sistema actual en el que se ejerce la propiedad en Chile y bueno, en todo el mundo, ¿cómo podríamos retribuir a los pueblos originarios este derecho a la propiedad? Porque este mismo concepto del derecho a la propiedad vendría a dar o a preestablecer o a continuar esta lógica colonial. ¿Cómo realmente podríamos darle un sentido a los pueblos originarios para que puedan establecer esta propiedad?
Thank you, Fabiola. I'm getting 2 translators speaking to me in English, which it's very generous, but I'm getting 2 simultaneous English translations, so it's a little so it's like hearing in stereo. But so Fabiola, thank you. What I understood you to be saying is that you're interested in the system in Chile regarding the ways in which indigenous people can claim rights to their land. I hope that's correct, and the degree to which that might also reflect certain continuing colonial logics. And I think that's I hope that's correct, and if it's not, then please do let me know. That's a very interesting dynamic. I wouldn't be surprised if there is not some continuing colonial logic. This has been an issue in other places as well. If we allow indigenous people, as we should, to have some recognized relationship to the land, what should that look like? Exactly what should that look like? And how should that translate into other relationships to land? I think that's a fundamental question. And in part, it's a technical question, but it's also, I think, a moral and political question that carefully needs thought, in particular, the advice of indigenous people themselves. One temptation, and this is, for example, the De Soto logic, Hernando de Soto has made this argument expressly, as well as others, is, well, obviously what indigenous people need is they need fee simple title. They need the sort of property that you find in the US, in the West, that is the mystery of capitalism. That's basically his argument. And so that has driven, so De Soto has come, he came some years ago, I remember, to Vancouver, and to talk to indigenous people, to explain to them why this was so needed. And there were in fact some indigenous people who came as well, because indigenous people do not have a legally recognized relationship to their land in Canada. They clearly have their own understanding, but the degree to which that is recognized or comports within a larger legal frame is hard to follow. But what was interesting was that many indigenous people said, no, that is exactly what we do not want. We do not want fee simple title for a whole variety of reasons. Some of them having to do with a concern about markets, that this facilitates commodification. It opens up markets. It monetizes indigenous lands in ways that threaten that land base and threaten a relationship which is predicated on many generations before and many generations going forward. Others are more pragmatic in that understanding. So there are differences. There is no one indigenous voice, I think, at play here. There needs to be different understandings, as there are different indigenous relationships to land in Chile and in different parts of Chile, as there would be in Canada. So it's a very important and pressing question that I think needs careful attention. Thank you very much for that.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Quizá aprovechando para meter la cuchara, en esta pregunta me estaba acordando de un artículo suyo de 2014, 2015, sobre el proceso de los tratados en Canadá y cómo el gobierno canadiense, si entendí bien el artículo, el gobierno canadiense insistió siempre en darle tierra en propiedad, en derecho pleno, digamos, ¿cierto? En propiedad absoluta, digamos, a los pueblos indígenas, pueblos originarios de Canadá, mientras que los abogados insistían en que era más complejo, había que hacer algo más. No era suficiente decir, ya ustedes tienen propiedad, sus tierras en propiedad, para que la puedan comprar, o sea, vender, comprar, enajenar, etcétera, sino que insistían, por lo que entendí, insistían que no, era más complejo. Habían otras relaciones sociales imbricadas en esa propiedad. La propiedad no podía ser algo tan simple, tan mercantilizadas, por lo que entendí. No sé si quizá puede hablar un poco más de esa idea, si nos puede contar un poco más.
Yes, thank you very much for that case. This was a project I was engaged in some years ago. In British Columbia, it's unusual because unlike other parts of Canada, there were no, with a very few exceptions, there were no treaties signed between colonial authorities and indigenous people. It was a sort of terra nullius logic that there was no relationship to the land, therefore there was no need for a treaty. And only recently was there a recognition that this was an unresolved question that needed to be addressed. And so a modern day treaty process was created, which led to many of the questions that was just outlined. The crucial question, or one of the crucial questions, was, okay, we're going to have a treaty between the indigenous people and the state, and as part of that, the indigenous people are going to get some of their land, a very small portion, some of their land back. How then will the indigenous people own their land? What will be the nature of the relationship legally between the indigenous people and their land? And what's interesting is that this process, which is deeply political, deeply ethical, becomes immediately a very legal question. So there are lawyers on both sides, lawyers for the state and indigenous lawyers agonizing about this relationship. And the argument from the state was, well, what you need to have is like what everyone else has. You need to own your land in fee simple title. That's the common law term, which is the highest form of private property you can have. And so they make a very technical argument, assuming that this technicality comes with no politics. It comes with no racialized history. It comes with no culture. But indigenous people, many of them at least, push back against that and say, in the same way that we have with preemption, property law is always inflected with moral, ethical, cultural understandings. It's not simply a black box of technicalities. It's always going to be inflected. And in the colonial context, it's going to be racialized. You can't escape that. And one of the things they pointed out appropriately was that their understanding of their relationship to the land was direct. The land and the nation are connected together and tied together through a long-standing connection that obviously predates the state, predates the colonial state, and is tied to a relationship to ancestors and to the spirits and the creator and so on. The problem with fee simple title, they pointed out, was that this was a European English colonial context that had been transported to a settler context. And technically speaking, in fee simple title, you don't actually own your land. What you have is you have an interest in your land that has been given to you by the crown. And this comes from Norman England. This comes from 11th century England and feudal law. The idea that the crown owns all the land and then grants titles to individuals, including the fee simple title. So their argument was, well, why would we want the crown to give us back our land that we have a direct, unmediated relationship to? No, the lawyers for the state says it's just a technicality. Don't worry about it. Hold your nose and carry on forward. But clearly, I think this is an interesting moment because it speaks to the kind of racialized logics at work here and the way in which this process opened up that black box and revealed those dimensions. So thank you for the question.
Muchas gracias por la respuesta. No sé si conocen un poco esa lógica. Es muy diferente la lógica en cada país. Por lo que he leído, esa es la figura, como dice Blomley, que viene de la época medieval, y entonces la corona es dueño, como el rey, ¿cierto? En su momento, la corona es dueño de todo el territorio y les deja como en casi una especie de, no sé, como arriendo o algo así, que se llama el interés, ¿cierto? El disfrute de la tierra que sigue siendo de la corona. Entonces, claro, produce estas situaciones un poco extrañas. Mauro tiene una pregunta.
Ahí está, ya. Buenas tardes, Nicolás. Una reflexión y una pregunta. Me llama la atención en la ponencia del preemption. Probablemente que la lógica colonial incluso sea más allá de esta distinción entre lo cultural entre lo anglo y lo latino. La figura esta del colono que avanza y que también toma jurisprudencia y cartas como agente y que se convierte como en una fusión entre lo que el Estado le da, le propicia. Acá en el sur de Chile sucedió lo mismo, básicamente. Estamos hablando siglo XIX, siglo XX. La justicia fue ejercida por manos de colonos también. Y es interesante cómo esta figura de la propiedad, cuando Pinochet irrumpe, digamos, en el sur de Chile, es un proceso particular que es precisamente propietarizar a las comunidades indígenas. La manera de asimilación es vía la propiedad. Es un mecanismo que utiliza Pinochet en el sur de Chile. Y la represión y la justicia que se hace en devolución de tierras tiene que ver con colonos que toman las armas en sus manos y ejecutan gente, etc. Entonces creo que después de 100 años esa lógica se reproduce independiente de, no sé si quienes habrán estado atrás y han tenido estos parámetros conceptuales anglo atrás o no, pero está esa figura. Y muchas veces, y eso se ha discutido incluso dentro del mundo mapuche, está también esta reflexión, si lo que hay que reclamar es la propiedad o el territorio. Es una encrucijada, un poco en esta misma lógica de por qué vamos a reclamar algo que es nuestro. Y ahí ha habido una bifurcación de caminos diversos, de parte de las comunidades y de parte del Estado. Y tal vez hay una pregunta nomás como de referencia, ¿cómo es la expresión hoy actual de los conflictos en Canadá territoriales y cómo el Estado está expresando esta defensa o no defensa de esos procesos aparentemente pasados de colonización? O cómo la enfrenta con los procesos actuales. Al menos en el caso chileno, ese proceso de colonización hoy día no es la figura del colono, sino la figura de las empresas transnacionales que se instalan y también empiezan a establecer una nueva jurisprudencia y un accionar también en los territorios frente a eso. Si nos puede relatar un poco la experiencia de ella.
Thank you very much. Yes, I would be really interested to try and think with you about the transferability of these ideas to Latin America and to the civil law context. One of the problems in thinking about law is that there is no law. There are multiple laws. There are multiple legal universes, and they don't always overlap neatly. But thinking about these connections, I think, would be something that I would be really interested in doing. So learning about the Chilean context is really interesting. In terms of the Canadian context, colonialism is, and this was the point I tried to make at the end, colonialism is still an active project. It's not finished by any means. It's not finished, particularly because indigenous people continue to assert relationships to land and claims to land and push back against settler logics in many powerful and important ways. And that is expressed in, well, one of the huge challenges, or one of the huge areas of conflict has been around resources, about oil, about carbon, and about pipelines in particular. The Chile, probably like British Columbia, is, it's a resource economy in which the economy is really tied to moving distant resources, great many kilometers to in infrastructures that then have to be exported to global markets. So in British Columbia, it's fish, it's lumber, it's minerals, and also now energy coming from other places. Those resources are, of course, on indigenous lands. Those lands are without a treaty. There's no resolution to those. They continue to be, relations to those land continue to be asserted by indigenous people, and they have proved very successful, actually, in challenging pipelines, in challenging the resource economy, and contesting this dispersed geography of the infrastructural geography of resource extraction. I'm a geographer, and so I think about these questions as well as thinking about the law. You raised also a question about, should we be fighting for property or should we be fighting for land? And that's a really interesting question. One of the arguments that my indigenous friends tell me is that their relationship to land is not a property relationship. They would refuse the term property precisely because property is this Western concept that comes with a set of Western colonial dimensions that cannot fail to capture, or cannot capture rather, a relationship to land, a relationship that goes beyond property. So they would argue that they need to fight for land. You could argue, however, that if you want to fight for land, you also need to be fighting for property. You need to be fighting for the legal infrastructure within and beyond that gives meaning, at least technical meaning, to that relationship. But that's another question for another day.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Quizá ahora ir cerrando. Bueno, muchas gracias, Nick, por el tiempo. Muchas gracias por conversar con nosotros. Gracias por la paciencia con todos los defectos que surgen en estas empresas de traducción a distancia, esta conversa así, no sé, como 5.000 kilómetros, algo así. Muchas gracias por compartir con nosotros. Y bueno, esperamos verlo también en algún momento. Y, sí, ¿quieren una foto? ¿Cómo es eso? Pero no va a salir una foto. Que todos vengan para una foto. Bueno, entonces todos van a venir para una foto. Bueno, pues, no sé si sale con... vamos a
That's
ponernos
wonderful.
ahí al lado de allá. ¿Cómo es eso? ¿Aquí nomás? ¿Ya? Ok. Venga, venga, venga. Exacto. Exacto. Queremos tener una prueba de su presencia aquí en nuestro seminario. Así que... Esta es lo... Sí. Sí. Ahí está. Ahí está. O puede ser más allá. Sí. 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 O al ladito de allá. Sí. Muy bien. Muchas gracias. Adelante, adelante. Sí, sí.
That's wonderful. That's so
Manuel,
wonderful.
¿puede o no? ¿Puede apagar esa
That
luz?
makes me very happy.
¿Sí? Oh, qué bueno. Sí. Así es. Gracias. ¿Listo? Ya. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Blomley. Sí. Bueno. Muchas gracias. Ahí está. Creo que hay otra ahí arriba también. Muchas gracias. Y bueno, con eso cerramos la sesión de la tarde. O sea, la primera sesión de la tarde. Ahí vamos a tener un pequeño café aquí al lado, como en la mañana, y después volvemos a las 4:30 para la sesión de los documentales. 4:45 me avisan. Ya, cambiamos un poquito el cronograma ahí, entonces 4:45 volvemos para los documentales. Así que eso, muchas gracias. Chao.
Thank you very, very much. And I look forward to visiting in the spring or the fall.